The docks of Brooklyn, New York. January 17, 1940. Before dawn. The air tastes of salt and diesel. Fog rolls thick across the East River, muting the city's heartbeat to a distant murmur. Along Pier 12, beneath the skeletal arms of loading cranes, men move in practiced silence, longshoremen, stevedores, union workers whose grandfathers built these same docks. Their breath rises in white plumes as they guide crate after crate onto the deck of a Norwegian freighter. The crates bear no markings, no flags, no destinations printed in bold letters. Just numbers, stenciled in black, that mean nothing to anyone who doesn't hold the manifest. Inside, artillery shells, 20mm cannon rounds, brass casings that catch the yellow glow of work lights like scattered coins. By sunrise, this ship will be gone, slipping past the Statue of Liberty into the gray Atlantic, carrying more explosive power than most European nations could produce in a month. And in Berlin, in the marble halls where intelligence reports pile like autumn leaves, there will be nothing. No warning, no alarm, just silence. This was not an anomaly. This was every day. To understand the magnitude of what occurred along America's eastern seaboard between 1940 and 1945, one must first comprehend the landscape of European industrial capacity at the war's outset. Germany, for all its vaunted rearmament under the Third Reich, entered World War II with an economy fundamentally constrained by geography and resources. The Treaty of Versailles had crippled its heavy industry for 2 decades. Even after Hitler's feverish reconstruction of the Wehrmacht, German munitions production in 1939 remained a carefully rationed affair, factories running double shifts, raw materials allocated by committee, every shell accounted for. The Reich's entire annual output of small arms ammunition in 1940 totaled approximately 1.5 billion rounds. Britain, exhausted from the Great War and still clinging to an empire spread thin as parchment, could manage perhaps 600 million rounds yearly, and that only by converting textile mills and automotive plants into makeshift armories. France, already on the edge of collapse, produced less. The Soviet Union, for all its landmass, was only beginning to recover from Stalin's purges and the relocation of factories eastward, away from German reach. And then there was New York. Not the New York of ticker tape and Broadway, though that existed too, but the New York of industrial might, a city whose manufacturing output in 1940 exceeded that of entire nations. In Brooklyn alone, the Navy Yard employed 75,000 workers. The Bethlehem Steel plant in Staten Island could forge more armor plating in a week than Krupp produced in a month. Across the river in New Jersey, the Picatinny Arsenal, the Frankfurt Arsenal's satellite operations, and dozens of private contractors, Remington, Winchester, Federal Cartridge, operated in an ecosystem of production that existed nowhere else on Earth. And this was before Pearl Harbor, before America formally entered the war, before the full might of the arsenal of democracy turned its face toward Europe. In the first 6 months of 1941, while still nominally neutral, the Port of New York processed more military cargo than passed through all British ports combined. The numbers are almost absurd in their scale. For 0.2 million artillery shells, 890 million rounds of small arms ammunition, 12,000 aircraft engines, 3,400 tanks and armor vehicles. This from a single city. And the German Abwehr, the military intelligence service that had successfully infiltrated governments across Europe, that had broken codes and turned agents and predicted Allied movements with eerie precision, saw almost none of it. In Berlin, in the winter of 1941, the men who managed the Reich's strategic assessments believed they understood America. They had read the reports from the embassy in Washington, studied the isolationist movements, the America First rallies where Charles Lindbergh spoke to crowds of 40,000. They knew the Depression had gutted the American heartland, that unemployment still hovered near double digits, that Roosevelt's New Deal programs were controversial and incomplete. They believed, as many Europeans believed, that America was soft, a nation of jazz and Hollywood, of excessive comfort and naive idealism. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, had compiled dossiers on American industrial capacity, and while he acknowledged its potential, the reports consistently concluded that American production was geared toward civilian consumption, not military manufacture, that it would take years to convert, that by the time the United States could meaningfully intervene, the war would be decided. This was not entirely foolish reasoning. It was based on precedent. During World War I, it had taken America 18 months after entering the conflict to field a fully equipped army in Europe. The assumption was that history would repeat itself, only this time, Germany would not make the mistake of allowing that time. The Blitzkrieg Doctrine, the swift conquest of Poland, the fall of France, these were designed in part to win the war before America could matter. What Canaris and his analysts failed to grasp was that the conversion had already happened. Not officially, not publicly, but in the quiet mathematics of factory retooling and supply contracts, in the Lend-Lease Act signed in March 1941, in the thousands of workers who arrived each morning at plants across New York already producing for a war that had not yet been declared. The German expectation was that American entry into the war, if it came, would be slow, hesitant, hampered by public opinion and industrial inertia. They expected America to behave like Britain in 1939, scrambling to arm itself while under direct threat. They did not expect what actually occurred, that America would arrive already armed, already producing at a rate that would, by 1943, exceed the combined output of all Axis powers. And the cruelest irony was that the intelligence was there. The information existed. It simply wasn't believed. In the archives of the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, there exists a report dated November 12, 1941, 1 month before Pearl Harbor. It was compiled by a low-level Abwehr analyst named Horst Mahler, who had previously worked as a commercial attaché in New York. Mahler's report, stamped Zur Information, for information only, attempted to estimate American munitions production based on import-export records, steel production figures, and labor statistics. His conclusion, that the United States was likely producing ammunition at a rate 3 to 4 times higher than official declarations suggested. The report included a specific warning about the Port of New York, noting that shipping manifests indicated unusually high volumes of agricultural machinery and industrial equipment being sent to Britain, codes, Mueller suspected, for military hardware. The report was filed and forgotten. Mueller's superiors dismissed it as alarmist speculation. After all, America was not at war. Roosevelt had promised the American people that their sons would not fight in foreign wars. The intelligence picture they believed was clear. America was sympathetic to Britain but constrained by domestic politics and economic reality. 1 month later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. For days after that, Germany declared war on the United States. And the gates opened. By January 1942, the Port of New York was no longer operating in secrecy. There was no need. The floodgates had burst. In that single month, 847 ships departed New York Harbor carrying war material. The number would only increase. By 1943, at the height of production, a Liberty ship, a mass-produced cargo vessel, was leaving an American port every 8 hours. Many of them came from New York. Many of them carried ammunition. The scale beggars comprehension. In 1943 alone, American factories produced 24 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. 24 billion. Germany's entire wartime production, from 1939 to 1945, totaled approximately 15 billion rounds. In a single year, America outproduced the Nazi war machine's 6-year total. And New York was the hub through which much of it flowed. The Brooklyn Army Terminal, a massive complex of warehouses and piers built specifically to handle military cargo, processed an average of 37 million tons of supplies annually during the war years. Artillery shells were stacked in pyramids 20 feet high, each one painted olive drab, each one destined for a gun somewhere in Europe or the Pacific. The longshoremen who loaded them worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. They earned good wages, union scale plus overtime, and they knew what they were doing mattered. Many had brothers or sons overseas. Each crate they loaded, each pallet they secured was a lifeline. The ammunition itself came from everywhere. The Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri, which by 1943 was the largest small arms ammunition factory on Earth, producing 4.5 million rounds per day. The Remington plants in Connecticut and Arkansas. The Winchester facilities in Illinois. Federal Cartridge in Minnesota. These were not small operations converted from civilian use. These were purpose-built war factories, sprawling complexes employing tens of thousands running triple shifts, producing ammunition with an efficiency that stunned even American planners. And all of it, or most of it, funneled through New York. There is a photograph, held in the National Archives, taken in March 1943. It shows a section of Pier 15 in Brooklyn. The perspective is from above, perhaps from a crane or a nearby rooftop. In the frame, you can see 18 freight cars lined up on the dockside rail spur, each one stacked with wooden crates. Longshoremen move between them like ants, guided by a foreman with a clipboard. In the background, a Liberty ship sits low in the water, already half-loaded. The caption, typed on the back of the photograph, reads, "Shipment to Liverpool. 500 tons 155 millimeters he shells." 500 tons. In one shipment. From one pier. On one day. And in Berlin, the intelligence summaries still underestimated American production by a factor of 3. The question that haunts historians is not whether German intelligence could have obtained this information. It could have. The shipments were not invisible. The factories were not hidden. The United States published production statistics, albeit with strategic delays and omissions. Neutral observers, journalists, even foreign workers in American plants could see what was happening. The question is why the information, when it did reach Berlin, was dismissed. Part of the answer lies in cognitive bias. The German High Command, and Hitler in particular, operated within a framework that refused to accept American industrial superiority. To admit that a democratic, racially mixed, consumer-oriented society could outproduce the disciplined, militarized, racially pure Reich was ideologically untenable. Hitler referred to America as a mongrel nation, incapable of the focus and will required for modern war. Goebbels' propaganda painted Americans as weak, distracted by trivialities, more concerned with refrigerators and automobiles than with martial virtue. To acknowledge the truth that America was burying Germany in sheer material output would have required dismantling core assumptions about racial and ideological superiority. But there was also a more mundane reason. The intelligence services were overwhelmed. By 1942, the Abwehr was focused on the Eastern Front, on partisan movements in occupied territories, on Allied invasion plans. Reports about American production were low priority, filed under economic intelligence rather than immediate tactical threat. And by the time the scale of American output became undeniable, by 1943, when German forces in North Africa and Italy were facing enemies equipped with seemingly limitless ammunition, it was too late to matter. The information no longer changed the strategic picture. Germany was losing the war of production, and no amount of intelligence could reverse that. There is a bitter poetry in the way the munitions flowed. Each shell that left New York carried with it a small piece of American abundance, not just in its explosive content, but in the very fact of its existence. In Germany, ammunition was rationed. Gunners were trained to fire conservatively, to make every shot count, because resupply was uncertain. In Italy, artillery units sometimes ceased fire entirely, waiting days for fresh shells to arrive from depots that were themselves running low. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers learned to scavenge Soviet ammunition, to strip enemy dead for cartridges, because their own supply lines were stretched to breaking. American soldiers, by contrast, operated in a reality where ammunition was almost unlimited. A single American infantry division in Europe in 1944 could fire more artillery shells in one day than the entire German army fired in the Battle of France. American doctrine did not emphasize conserving ammunition. It emphasized using it. Overwhelming the enemy with firepower, breaking resistance through sheer material superiority. And this was possible because every day in New York, ships left carrying more. The symbolic weight of this cannot be overstated. In the ideological contest between fascism and democracy, between centralized control and free enterprise, the munitions became proof of concept. Here was democracy, messy and argumentative and inefficient in so many ways, outproducing the streamlined authoritarian state by orders of magnitude. Here was the free market, supposedly weak and decadent, retooling itself for war faster than any command economy. The factories of New York, of Detroit, of Pittsburgh did not run on orders from a Fuhrer. They ran on contracts, on labor agreements, on the profit motive and the union hall, on the voluntary cooperation of millions. And they worked. By the winter of 1944, the disparity had become grotesque. German ammunition production, hampered by Allied bombing and the loss of occupied territories, had fallen to less than half its 1942 levels. German gunners in the Ardennes offensive, the last great German gamble in the West, were limited to 20 rounds per gun per day. American gunners facing them had no limit. They could fire 100 rounds, 200, until the barrels glowed red, and the ground shook, and the German positions simply ceased to exist under the weight of high explosive. In the Pacific, the arithmetic was even starker. Japanese industry, never on the scale of American production, had been gutted by submarine warfare and strategic bombing. Japanese soldiers on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa fought with ammunition they had stockpiled years earlier, knowing no more was coming. American Marines landed on those islands backed by naval bombardments that expended more shells in an hour than Japan could produce in a month. And it all began, in a sense, on those foggy mornings in Brooklyn, with longshoremen loading crates onto freighters, one pallet at a time. There is a letter written in April 1945 by a German artillery officer named Klaus von Schirach, found among his effects after his capture. Von Schirach had fought in France in 1940, in Russia in 1941 and 42, and finally in the defense of Germany itself in 1945. The letter, addressed to his wife, was never sent. In it, he describes the impossibility of his situation, not the tactics, not the strategy, but the simple mathematics. "We fire 10 shells," he wrote, "and they answer with 100. We conserve, we aim carefully, we make every shot count. And it doesn't matter. They can afford to miss. They can afford to waste. They can afford to fire for hours just to suppress a single machine gun nest. And we cannot answer because we have nothing left to answer with." This was the reality that German intelligence had failed to predict. Not that America would fight, but that it would fight with such crushing material advantage that tactics and training and even courage would become secondary. The war was not decided by better soldiers or smarter generals. It was decided by the fact that one side could afford to fire 100 shells for every 10 the other side could manage. And that ratio, that overwhelming disparity, was built on the docks of New York. After the war, when researchers and historians began to piece together the intelligence failures of the Third Reich, the question of American production capacity became a case study in institutional blindness. How could Germany, with its sophisticated intelligence apparatus, fail to understand the scale of what was happening? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, lies in the intersection of ideology and information. The Nazis built a worldview in which they were the superior force, racially, militarily, industrially. Information that contradicted that worldview was not suppressed, exactly. It was simply not integrated. It existed in reports, in file cabinets, in the margins of briefing documents, but it never penetrated the decision-making core. And so the ships kept leaving. Every day, every night, through fog and storm, through U-boat wolfpacks and mine fields, they left New York Harbor carrying the tools of Germany's destruction. And in Berlin, the silence continued. Not because there was nothing to hear, but because no one was listening. On May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, American forces in Europe had expended approximately 4.7 billion rounds of small arms ammunition and 29 million artillery shells. The logistics of moving that amount of material across the Atlantic through France into Germany itself represented the largest sustained industrial military effort in human history. And at the heart of it, at the nexus where production met distribution, stood New York, the city that out-armed Europe without firing a shot. The docks are quieter now. The longshoremen's unions are smaller, the freight mostly containerized, handled by machines rather than men. The Brooklyn Army Terminal is a logistics center, still operating, but without the urgency of those war years. The piers where Liberty ships once moored now host cruise ships and ferries. The cranes still stand, but they lift different cargo, consumer goods from China, automobiles from Japan, the ordinary traffic of peace. But walk along those docks at dawn when the fog rolls in from the Atlantic, and you can almost hear it, the sound of crates sliding across steel decks, the grunt of men lifting, the warning shouts, the groan of cranes. You can almost see the numbers stenciled on wooden boxes, the manifests clutched in cold hands, the ships slipping out into the gray water, heavy with the weight of a nation's promise. That promise was simple and overwhelming. We will bury you in abundance. We will win not because we are stronger, but because we can afford to be wasteful. Because we can fire 1,000 shells to destroy one target, and tomorrow there will be 1,000 more. This was the truth that German intelligence could not accept and that history would record in the silent ledgers of production. That freedom, for all its inefficiencies, builds factories faster than tyranny. That democracy, for all its arguments, produces more than dictatorship. That the docks of Brooklyn, manned by union workers and immigrants and the sons of immigrants, could supply more ammunition than all of Europe combined. And that silence, in the face of such overwhelming evidence, is not ignorance. It is ideology's last defense against an unbearable truth. The war was not won in Berlin, or Moscow, or Normandy. It was won in places like Pier 12, in the cold January darkness, one crate at a time, by men whose names are forgotten, but whose labor spoke louder than any intelligence report ever could. And when the last ship sailed, when the war ended and the factories retooled for peace, what remained was the lesson written in shell casings and freight manifests, that some silences are not born of secrecy, but of refusal, and that the cost of refusing to see is always, always paid in full. The fog lifts. The city wakes. The ships are gone. But the truth remains, stacked like crates on an empty dock, waiting for anyone willing to count them.